Hey everyone, good morning. Happy Monday. It's Rebecca Undem, and you are watching Rebecca Undem Live, the weekly Facebook show where we tackle one simple topic every single week to help you live big in your small town. Hope you guys had an amazing weekend. So this month, so we do a monthly theme at Rebecca Undem and Rebecca Undem Live, and we this month are talking about the idea of tending your garden because it doesn't look like spring at all in North Dakota yet, still tons of snow. But this is when we all start kind of thinking about fresh beginnings, new starts, and tending a garden, like a legitimate garden. And we're really talking about this in the context of what goes on between our ears, okay? So good morning, Annie. Hey, welcome back, sister. Can't wait to hear about your trip. Super excited to have you here. So today, the topics so far have been about focusing on planting, letting go of the outcome. Today, we're going to be talking about one of my very favorite phrases. And if you've ever heard me speak, this is something that I talk about a lot when I'm invited to speak at various events. And it's the phrase, bloom where you're planted. And we're going to actually take this into two separate chunks. So good morning to Jayette. Good morning to Tamara. We've got Dee and Shelly. Good morning, ladies. I feel like you're all chipper this morning. That's awesome. So I think you guys are going to love this topic. This idea of blooming where you're planted is something that I think is so important, especially for those of us who are living in a small town and maybe it wasn't the plan, right? So like, how the hell do you figure out how to show up like you really are, regardless of where you're at? And I feel like this is such an important topic that I wanted to actually break it into two parts. So today, this is part one. Today, we're just going to be talking about blooming. Like, what does it really mean to bloom? And then next week, we're going to come back and talk about the where you're planted piece, which is really about environment, right? So we've got LaDonna and Jessie with us. Good morning, ladies. So for those of you, again, most of you that are on, I think you know me by now, but if you've invited friends and you're new to me, my name is Rebecca Undem. I am the author of a book called How Mommy Got Her Groove Back. And I'm a motivational speaker, and I speak and discuss all things related to growth, personal growth and development. I love I just never get sick of talking about how to get better no matter where we're at, no matter what we're doing. So even though my book is called How Mommy Got Her Groove Back, it is a book for all women. So totally check that out if you haven't read it already. And so let's get into the topic. Whitney's on. Good morning, Whitney. So excited to see you here. Gosh, it's going to be a great morning. I can already tell just based on who I'm hanging out with today. Okay, so as I said, bloom where you're planted. One of my very favorite phrases, not just to say, and certainly not to say in any sort of cliche kind of way, because it is tricky. So like I said at the start, we're going to break this into two parts. Today, we're really going to talk about blooming. Good morning, Cheryl. So happy to have you here too. Okay, so the idea, it seems like such a simple concept, but I think generally speaking, everything that is simple tends to be some of the hardest things to actually do and to put into practice. Okay, so the goal, you think about bloom where you're planted, the goal is not merely survival. The goal isn't just to get by. The goal isn't just to survive. It's to actually bloom. So when you think about, again, like this whole month about tending your garden, we're all going to be thinking about spring. Hopefully, pretty soon we'll actually be able to get our hands in some dirt and put some stuff in the ground. And it's the best time of the year, isn't it? When things get to actually come back, especially from a long winter. Okay, so when we think about blooming from the standpoint of a plant or a shrub or a tree, generally speaking, a plant, a shrub, or a tree is blooming when it produces either flowers or fruit of some sort, right? Depending on what kind of a plant it happens to be. The same is true with people. Blooming means that all of our best qualities, all of the things that make us beautiful and who we really are visible. So here's the catch-22 about this whole thing. I think sometimes, and especially depending on the environment, that we sometimes feel like we know what our gifts are, but we're afraid because of where we're at to actually step into them fully and be who we are. So what I have found with all the women that I have talked to over the years now, There are generally 3 fears that hold us back from fully blooming. And really, again, it's, showing up as you truly are. And like I love to say, my favorite phrase is being full strength you. There are generally 3 fears that hold us back from that. And then there's more. There's more, I imagine, but to me, these will really distill them down to the 3 big things that we worry about the most. And I'm going to actually just ask you guys to throw the number in that you feel like you struggle with the most. Number 1 is the fear of inadequacy. So this general feeling that you are just not good enough. Okay, so if that resonates with you, throw that down. But wait, of course, because 2 and 3 maybe it's all 3. We'll see. Number 2 is a fear of failure. Like just, of course, that just general fear that if I do this, if I show up, if I take my mask off, I'm going to screw up and I'm going to actually make a mistake. And then number 3 is the fear of judgment, which again, I think in a small town, for those of you that are living and working in small towns, that is one of the biggest fears that we struggle with. So real quick, while you guys are listening to this, throw in the comments which ones you struggle with. Is it 1, fear of inadequacy, 2, fear of failure, or 3, fear of judgment? Which seems to plague you the most? And then we're going to look at some ideas, like how do we move through them? Because obviously just addressing the fears, that's not so fun, right? So I'm going to take a sip of coffee while I see you guys. So Annie's got 2 and 3. Tiff joined. Hey, Tiff. Hey, girl. Hey. Okay, Kristen's like, all 3. Cindy says number 1, that fear of inadequacy. Judgment is D. Oh, 1, 2, and 3, I know. And then some like little laughy faces. That's good, Jesse. You got a good sense of humor about it. And then we've got Lorena saying 1 and 3. I know, Tamara, big deal with you. Gosh, I'm so excited for you. She says all 3, but I'm jumping anyway. We got number 2. We got all 3. Number 3. Okay, 1 and 3. All right. So I figured based on, I feel like I know you people, right? Like I know and I get this. So we're going to talk about some antidotes to help you through some of these things. And I really want you guys and encourage you guys to jump in with questions or thoughts or comments, because this is all about you. And I will tell you that every single day I swallow these things down still. And that's, I think, there's 2 kind of big things that I want you to know about these fears to begin with. 1, it never really fully goes away. It is a lifelong journey. And because part of it is that as we grow and as we develop, our comfort zones get bigger, right? If you just think about it in the sense of like the comfort zone getting bigger, every time we push ourselves, every time we try something new and we fail or we don't fail, whatever. It's not about the result. It's about the fact that every time we push ourselves, our tolerance for risk expands. Our tolerance for uncertainty expands. So you get this slowly blossoming, growing comfort zone. There's still edges to it. So no matter how far we grow, no matter how much we learn, there's still edges and, sides to where we go, oh my gosh, if we get close to that, I'm still afraid. So the first thing to know, because women especially, we have this ridiculous notion that if we can only get to a certain level or we achieve a certain thing, then suddenly we won't feel these feelings anymore. That is not how this works. It's not how it works at all. It just means it may take longer before that feeling comes up, but if you keep pushing yourself as a person, you're constantly going to be courted by fear. So that's the first thing that I really, really want you guys to know. And secondly, it's to just kind of surrender to that, to know that, because once we know that, once we become honestly a little bit comfy with the idea that fear is always going to be along for the ride, it takes the sting out of it. And I hope that makes sense to you guys, because seriously, once you're like, okay, you feel that fear and you say to yourself, okay, I was waiting for you to show up. It's a totally different dialogue. Like you can actually talk to your fear like that. I certainly do. That's what makes me crazier than the average person. But first thing is to recognize that those fears, whether it's number 1, number 2, or number 3, it doesn't matter. Those fears, and I think we all have kind of a pet fear, something to think about too. There's probably one that will plague you more than others, okay? But remembering that even as we grow, there's an edge to what we're comfortable with, and then we get close to that. I think I've said this to you guys before, is that somebody had told me once to think of your fear as border patrol. So if you think of them standing at the patrol, like patrolling the borders of your comfort zone, as soon as you get close to it, they will pull their guns out. They will look at you and they will say, you shouldn't go out there. It's dangerous out there, and it's our job to keep you safe. So ma'am, please step back and go back to where you were, right? If you think about it like that, it's a perfect analogy. It's their job. Our fears, every self-talk, like negative self-talk that comes into play when we're trying to do something different, it's to keep us safe. Okay, so Mary, thank you. I love that. So that's, people think they can outgrow fear. We don't out-succeed fear. It doesn't happen. It just becomes a different set of things we think about when we continue to grow and we continue to succeed. Okay, so let's talk about fear of inadequacy, the first one. This is simply a fear that we're not enough. Okay, so we're not smart enough. We're not witty enough. We're not professional enough. We're not educated enough. We're not skinny enough. We're not something enough. And it's whatever we think the people and the environment needs, we believe in some way, shape, or form that we are not good enough for it. We just don't have enough of it. Logically, we all know that every single one of us is flawed. We know that we're all imperfect. But the truth is, most of us have not figured out how to actually accept and love ourselves and others because of those imperfections instead of in spite of them. Like you're awesome and all these things are kind of crappy about you, but I love you in spite of those things. No, it's like those things that are crappy about you or me or any of us are the things that make us who we are. So it's what makes us lovable. It's not something we love in spite of. Okay, so there is absolutely nothing simple about learning to embrace your imperfections. But one of the simplest ways to start to think about it is this. Okay, so if you struggle with feeling like you're just not enough in some way, shape, or form, think about a person that you love more than anybody else. Okay, so maybe it's a spouse, maybe it's a kid. I have no idea who this person is, and there's no judgment on that. Okay, it's whoever you love the most. And think about all the things that you love about that person. Get the list down. I'm sure it's like they're dreamy and they're amazing and they're good in bed, like whatever, I don't care. Okay, then think about all the things that perturb you about that person. Their flaws or their imperfections. Think about those things. Okay, more than likely you've got a list of both, because we're people, right? And you can see those things. And it's easy to do this with somebody else, thinking about somebody else outside of you. The next time that feeling of inadequacy starts to creep in, because here's the thing, everybody that's watching, is that the problem comes not just with the fear, but it's how we talk back to the fear. It's that inner dialogue that happens when we start to feel overwhelmed by one of those fears or all of them. It's the self-talk that we get to control. We don't get to control that the fear shows up. It's going to show up. Sometimes it'll blindside us. Sometimes we'll be expecting it. No matter what, we don't get to control that. We get to control what we say back to it. So now that you've got this picture in your mind of this person that you love and hold and you cherish so much in spite of their flaws, the second that feeling of imperfection or inadequacy starts to creep in, that fear that you're not good enough, you imagine that person that you love standing in front of you and you ask yourself, how would I comfort them? How would I speak to them if it was them in the situation instead of me? And then turn that language toward yourself. This is one of those things that almost makes me want to cry when I think about it, because I think as women, a lot of women I know, we are really, really good at comforting and loving and accepting other people in our lives through these kinds of moments. We're really, really good at it. And that's such a gift, isn't it? I mean, it's wonderful to be empathetic and to have compassion and to be able to look at someone and say, you've got this and you are good enough. And think of all the things you do well. You think of how you talk somebody like a good friend or your spouse or whoever that person you love so much, how you talk them through a situation like that. Why are we so incapable of turning that same kind of love and grace towards ourselves? Because really the whole goal is to learn how to be gracious and loving towards ourselves, to accept and embrace the fact that we do have flaws and we do have imperfections. And it doesn't mean we're not enough. It means we're perfectly okay. We are not perfect. We are perfectly okay because everybody's got something, right? So if you feel that fear of inadequacy, learn how to talk to yourself, to the fear, the same way you would if it was a good friend standing in front of you. Because ultimately we should try to be a good friend to ourselves as well. Okay. Let's talk about fear of failure. Again, logically, we all know that success doesn't come without failure, right? Like nobody comes out of the gate being a rock star at whatever it is that they're trying. Again, logic is one thing, but the emotional, the heart-wrenching feelings of going through failure and like screwing up and not hitting a goal, even maybe missing a target, that hurts. And emotionally, it's draining, and emotionally, it's scary. Okay. So obviously we need to do something, because it's not just what we're thinking about, it's what we're feeling. That's why fears tend to take over and hijack us from getting what we want. So here are a couple of ways to work past the fear of failure. Again, this is where I'm really going to remind you that nobody out succeeds it. So I think of really successful people like Tony Robbins as somebody I think about. And he's talked about this, I think, at least in a couple of interviews, that he still has fears. We think about people that are brave as being fearless. Fearless really ain't a thing. I don't think that anybody on the planet is actually fearless. What they are is they see their fear for what it is, and they choose to move through anyway. They choose themselves over the fear. They put themselves ahead of the fear. Okay? So nobody out succeeds fear. The second thing, the biggest idea that I have for you is to stay focused on growth, because again, logically, we all know that nobody becomes super successful without screwing up a lot along the way, making mistakes, trying something out. It doesn't work. It fails. And again, with failure, you've got to think it could be real or perceived. Your idea of a failure, or that you actually screwed up, right? It doesn't matter. It all feels the same. Asking yourself two big questions. Once you have experienced something that you perceive, or maybe actually is a misstep, a missed, achievement, a screw up, a mistake. The first is, what did I learn from this experience? Just really think because sometimes there's something that you learned that once you know it, and oh gosh, you guys, I think about watching children learn how to walk. Okay. This is the example that pops into my head all the time. They know nothing about how to walk. They have no idea how to balance. They have no idea that you need to even put both like a foot in front of the next one. They have no idea what any of it looks like mechanically, right? They get up, they take a couple wobbly little steps, and they fall down. Every single time they fall down, it's not like they're logically sitting there thinking, what did I learn from this? But they're learning something. They're learning how to get their balance, how to catch themselves, how to have momentum. They're learning all of these things. And sometimes for us, there's an actual lesson that we can learn that will keep us, save us from making the same mistake again. So asking yourself, what's the lesson? What did I learn? The second is to say, how will I grow as a person from this? So again, thinking about, is there an actual tangible lesson to learn? And the second is, how am I better because of this? And you know what? Sometimes it's not always super evident. And I'm just going to say it. I've had a couple of experiences where it just feels like, what did I learn from this? That people suck and life sucks. How does that help me? It honestly, maybe there's not a lesson, but the thing is for me, how do I grow as a person? I learn how to get through shitty, difficult times. I persevered through it. And I still maybe kept my sense of humor, or I realized that I needed to surround myself with the right kind of people, or whatever it is. But thinking about it, sometimes it's not this clear, obvious, like, this is your sign, this is the lesson. Sometimes it literally is, life sucks, and you've got to figure out how to move through it. But as a person, it's like notches in a belt in the best way, right? Every single failure, every single hardship, every single trial, it develops character in you. And you can think about, how am I better because of this experience? Okay. So that's the prize. That is the prize to keep your eye on, because if we focus on always getting better and always learning, the sting of a missed target, it lessens significantly, because we can look at it for what it is and recognize that we still are better because of having experienced it. Okay. Number 3, fear of judgment. One of my favorite, and one that I spend a good amount of time talking about in my keynote message, because again, I think oftentimes I'm working and talking to women that are in small towns, and damn, can small towns be tough for this particular one. But you know what? We all struggle with fear of judgment. We don't get a corner on it just because there's less people in our environment. Okay. All right. So one of my favorite people of all time, and I've never met her, and I think it should be a bucket list for me to meet Brene Brown. So Brene Brown wrote a series of books. One of my favorites that I will highly, highly recommend is Braving the Wilderness. It's her most recent one. She was just in an interview with somebody else that I love in the personal development space, Marie Forleo. And this is what she said. There's been some clips, maybe you guys have seen them on Facebook, but I'm going to share this because I think if there were anything that sums up, I mean, this is like the thing that sums up how ridiculous it is for us to constantly be seeking validation from other people. So Brene Brown said in an interview with Marie Forleo, she said, don't walk through the world looking for evidence that you don't belong, because you will always find it. Don't walk through the world looking for evidence that you're not enough, because you will always find it. Our worth and our belonging are not negotiated with other people. We carry those inside of our heart. I know who I am. I'm clear about that. And I'm not going to negotiate that with you. I may fit in for you. So if she negotiates it, she says, I may fit in for you, but I will no longer belong to myself. And that's a betrayal that I'm not willing to do anymore. So this kind of comes back to inadequacy too. I think the fear of inadequacy, but this really comes down to always asking yourself the question, whose approval am I seeking and why? Because what she's talking about is true belonging means that you know yourself and you love yourself and you are confident and secure with yourself. Now, this isn't to say that we don't ever struggle with insecurity. All of us do from time to time. But you've really got to think about this and ask yourself, whose approval am I seeking and why? And the hardest thing about all of this is that oftentimes we don't really know why. But unless we can ask ourselves the question, we're never going to get an answer to that. It's got to be something that we consciously try to understand, especially if you're a person that's constantly seeking validation from other people. Okay? So that's the first question that you need to ask yourself when you feel the fear of judgment and you're afraid of what everyone else is thinking about you. My statement that I always say in my keynote is, what other people think of you is none of your business. One of my good friends gave me that line, and I seriously, certain days especially, like let's just say last week I had I'm on a couple of committees in this community, and I needed that one, like on a sandwich board. I always joke about wearing things on a sandwich board so everybody knows, like, this is what I'm feeling right now. But it's a really important one, is to remember that what other people think of you isn't your business. It's not your problem. Because most of the time what other people are thinking about you has nothing to do with you. It is about them and their perceptions and the filter through which they see the world. Okay, so if you struggle with the fear of judgment, the first thing to ask is, whose approval am I seeking and why? The second thing to ask yourself, and you're going to have to do a little work on this, is to ask, who am I really? This is time to get out a pen and paper, talk about the things you love, talk about your gifts, talk about what you uniquely contribute. Talk about what you're not so great at. Talk about the things you love, talk about the things you don't like. Think about the people that you want to hang out with. Think about the people that you don't want to spend time with. Get it all down on paper and then look at it and say, this is who I am, and I am not going to negotiate this with anybody else. This is hard work, okay? I'm not going to say that it's simple. It's certainly not easy. But the whole idea is that the validation that we're seeking, that approval, has to come from inside of us. The fear of judgment is all about other people. If we are being true to who we are, being not just full strength us, but also living by values that we've determined to be important to us, living by a set of belief system or a moral compass that we believe is important to us. What other people think about it truly doesn't matter. So get clear about who you really are and the things that you will and will not negotiate. Your belonging and your value is one of those things, okay? All right, so I seriously hope that this discussion of fears, so we talked about the fear of inadequacy. I'm going to give you a quick recap, just because I think it's important to recap. The three things that hold us back from fully blooming, because we're talking about blooming where you're planted, and we're really just talking about blooming today. How do you show up full strength you, giving the world the gifts that you only possess, okay? The fear of inadequacy is the first one that we talked about. And the best and most important thing to do if you struggle with the fear of inadequacy is to think about a person you love and think about when that fear starts to creep in for you, to talk to that fear exactly the way you would talk to a person that you love and care about. Talk to yourself, treat yourself as a friend. The second is a fear of failure. The two things to remember here is one, we don't ever out-succeed failure. It's going to come along for the ride, no matter how successful we become. The second is to ask two questions after every real or perceived failure. The first is, what did I learn? What lesson can I take away from this? And two is, how will I grow as a person? The third is a fear of judgment. What we talked about was not negotiating your value or your belonging with anybody else and asking yourself two questions. The first is, whose approval am I seeking and why? And the second is, who am I really? And taking the time to just dive deep with yourself, think about what it is that you love, what it is that you don't love. And the biggest thing when we do that, everybody that's watching still with me, is that it becomes really clear that you're negotiating your value. What Brene Brown talks about, this negotiating your value, it becomes really clear because you go, I don't even care. Like, I hold a completely different set of values than that person. Why do I care what they think about me? And again, like, this is such a tricky thing, right? Because this doesn't mean that we move through the world just giving 0 Fs what anybody ever thinks ever. But we're talking about simple things. I mean, if you've got a husband, like, what he thinks matters. Okay, so I always feel like to throw that caveat in there. If you're married, you have a spouse, his opinion matters. But we're talking about 80% of the time, we are worried about somebody that doesn't have a single stake in what happens to us, one way or the other. And we give them the power to get us to negotiate our belonging with ourselves. Fitting in is not the same as belonging, okay? So I hope that this was helpful. I hope that you guys will really take these things to heart, because all of you are worthy. All of you have things that you need to be giving to the world and showing up wherever you're at. It doesn't matter. We're going to talk about the environment next week. But this idea of blooming is really thinking about, like, what are the awesome things that you possess that you can give that you're not giving? And that means you're not blooming. If you're laying low in a state of dormancy, that is not a state that you stay in forever. Dormancy has a season. It is time to open back up and fully bloom, okay? No matter where you're at. So the last thing I'll say is snag your groove wallpaper. This month's wallpaper is directly tied to this whole thing about gardening. And it's honestly, again, it's just a good hit of inspiration when you're feeling a little low, okay, for your phone or your desktop. I'll put the link down. Second is join the Groove Seekers community. Invite your friends to join the Groove Seekers community. It's a place where we can talk. It's, great conversation, real support, real life stuff. And as always, I just love so much that you guys hang out with me here every Monday. Thank you, Annie. Thank you, Tiff. I love you. And thank you for loving this. And Mary, thank you. I'm glad that you felt it was powerful for you today. As always, if you guys have topics or things that you want us to address, either in the Groove Seekers group or you just want me to jam on, all you got to do is ask. Next week, we're going to talk about the second half of the statement, Bloom Where You're Planted, and it's really about environment. Okay, so make sure you stay tuned for that. And I just keep saying it, but invite your buddies. Make sure that you share this message. If this is something that matters to you, it matters to the people who love you. Okay? All right, with that, groove on, everybody, until I see you next Monday, and have an awesome week, okay? Love you guys. Bye.